So let's try to figure out what is going on here at the White House, because it seems as though they're trying to piece together this strategy, sending out this blistering letter, hiring outside counsel, also though saying this isn't a formal impeachment inquiry. And it's interesting, if you look at the letter, it is very Trump-esque. You know, this was a letter from Pat Cipollone, the White House counsel. But do you think by sort of trumping it up, if you will, that sort of undermines perhaps some of the merits in the letter? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, their biggest offense is what they've been saying for so long, is that the Democrats are hysterical and want to overturn the results of the 2016 election because they hate Trump. Like, this is what you hear everywhere. You can't get away from this talking point. But I do think among Trump's allies on the Hill and in the media, it's starting to feel like the boy who cried wolf. He's been saying it so much, but there's really something here. And you do see the more intellectually honest people who do try to talk about this say, listen, yeah, this is bad, but it's not impeachable. That's not a great conversation to have with the Democrats, because if you admit it bad, you should be willing to do something to hold them account for it. If you think it's bad, how do you trust this president to continue to conduct foreign policy amidst another election? I don't think they've gotten that far, but those are the natural questions that lead that I don't think they know how to answer.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, you know, even Tucker Carlson came out and wrote an op-ed saying, even Tucker Carlson said, this was not a great conversation. This was not a good conversation. Donald Trump, of course, has described it as a perfect conversation. Tucker disagrees with him. And yeah, once you do that, then you're in a different ballgame. You're talking about, well, you know, what do we do about it? It's not just imagination. When you said the White House strategy, I think Jay Rosen, the media critic, has a good line about how there is no White House. I mean, the idea that there's a coordinated strategy, there's no evidence of that on any scandal that we've seen in the last 3 years. Do you think the White House, quote unquote, the White House, wanted Donald Trump to stand in front of reporters and say, and China, you should investigate Joe Biden too? I'm pretty sure that wasn't part of any legal or political strategy. He just goes out and says mad stuff. So as long as he keeps doing that, he will continue digging his own hole. It's what the Democrats do with that hole. You know, subpoena, but how are you going to enforce it? What contempt are you going to throw out there against officials who don't turn up? And then just one last point. The idea of Trey Gowdy, whose idea was that, to hire Trey Gowdy as your outside counsel? We saw the clip in the package where he's done a U-turn. He's done a U-turn. That's true. He's done a U-turn like Lindsey Graham. But yeah, the idea that the guy who ran the fake Benghazi inquiries where there was no story is the guy you're going to go to try and discredit what clearly is a real story.
And it seems like, to me, it's also a way to put Rudy on the sidelines more than
perhaps. Trey Gowdy all over television. I am very curious to see how those interviews go, because I imagine they're going to begin frequently with the clip of how he ran some of these Benghazi investigations. Exactly. And I also think, look, lawmakers have not been in town, which is hard to remember because some have been because they thought they were going to get witnesses. But for the most part, lawmakers have been at home, and they are about to come back, and Republicans especially will not be able to hide from Manu Raju and the rest of the press corps.
Exactly.
That's on Capitol Hill, chasing them down and saying, okay, you had your time back in your districts. You had a couple weeks to figure out what you were going to say. What are you going to say? How are you going to just explain this away? And if you don't think it's an impeachable offense, as you were saying, so what do you do about it? If you think that this is just cringeworthy and toes the line of selling American democracy but isn't impeachable, well, then where are you just going to sit back?
You know, I don't want to be the skunk in the room, but let me try to be that.
It's all right.
Go for it.
Really? But I do think there's an emergent, if not strategy, at least tactics that are consistent. I think Trey Gowdy makes perfect sense. We're not talking about Ukraine. The president has pivoted the conversation to something that Republicans are going to be more comfortable with. Should the president be impeached or not? No conversation in the last half hour has been about Ukraine. Trey Gowdy is not there to explain why it's appropriate to ask a foreign power to intervene in America. He's there to tell the people, as the president will say at rallies, I told you I was going to drain the swamp. The swamp is trying to reverse the election again. I think, I'm not sure it's calculated, but it's starting to clarify.
And it might work at the rallies, because lots of mad stuff he says works at the rallies. But as I said, the polls, even, you know, we're barely, 2 weeks in? What kind of keep track of it? The polls are really bad for the president. We know he pulls over these polls. And that's going to make him even crazier.
That's going to make him crazier as he sort of grapples how to move forward here. Thank you so much, guys. We still have a lot more news to get to.
U.S. allies are under attack. Turkey's President Erdogan says that the military offensive in northern Syria has officially begun, and the situation is developing quickly. The onslaught is aimed at clearing U.S.-backed Kurdish forces away from Turkey's border. This is all happening just days after President Trump announced that U.S. troops would move out of Turkey's way, essentially abandoning one of America's closest allies in the fight against ISIS. According to the Syrian Democratic Forces, there is huge panic right now in this part of the the world as warplanes have started to carry out airstrikes. Hundreds of civilians are now being forced to quite literally run for their lives, and there are reports already of casualties. President Trump's decision to pull U.S. troops out of this area has pitted both Democrats and Republicans in Congress against this administration, and that includes one of the president's fiercest and most vocal defenders, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham. So in a series of tweets, the senator called Turkey's operation a quote-unquote disaster in the making and said, "Pray for our Kurdish allies who have been shamelessly abandoned by the Trump administration. This move ensures the reemergence of ISIS." Just adding to that, Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney also weighed in. She called it sickening and tweeted that it's impossible to understand why Trump is leaving America's allies to be slaughtered. Joshua Geltzer is a former senior director of counterterrorism at the National Security Council. So Josh, thank you so much for being with me. Gosh, there's a lot to get through. Just beginning with, can you talk to me about how fast this is all happening right now in this part of the world and how this shows the U.S.'s presence in the region, or lack thereof, made a huge difference?
Well, the speed at which this is unfolding is part of what makes it so sickening. You know, the president has in some ways been consistent about wanting to reduce the U.S. presence and even involvement in Syria. And those of us who have criticized that and criticized it when it's been too hasty have our arguments. But here, to do this so abruptly, to have asked so recently the Syrian Kurds, who've been such extraordinary partners, to dismantle defensive things they had built to try to protect themselves from a Turkish onslaught, and suddenly to now unleash essentially Turkey upon them, that's a humanitarian disaster. It's also bad strategy for the United States.
Clarissa, tell us what you were seeing.
So, Brianna, we were right on the outskirts of the town of Ras Al Ain in the aftermath of those first wave of strikes coming from Turkish artillery. We believe we saw thick black plumes of smoke of at least 6 different strike targets. The air was just thick with that smoke. There was a fire also, apparently a cotton factory that had caught fire after being hit by a strike. And then what we saw was this just overwhelming wave of civilians trying desperately to get out of this town, fearful for their lives. The streets choked with traffic, cars with mattresses strapped to roofs, women, children in the back of flatbed trucks. I approached some of them and asked them where they were going, and they told me simply, Brianna, we don't know where we're going. We don't know where it's safe. They have no sense of the scope and scale of this Turkish operation. We're hearing that at least 4 different towns were targeted as a part of the first wave of this Turkish military operation. Kurdish authorities are also saying 1 civilian has been killed, 7 injured, including 2 children. And the question that everyone is asking is, what next and where next? And this is a vast area, Brianna. You're talking about a 200-mile swath of territory along that border, making it very difficult for civilians to know where exactly they should head to next. But a palpable sense of fear and concern here. A lot of Kurdish people had dared to hope that perhaps President Trump would change his mind, that perhaps the U.S. would intervene and avert this from happening. But now it's clear this Turkish military operation is underway, and it's clearly going to be bloody.
Thanks to a simple idea and the immense patience of his wife, this Japanese superfan has become a cult figure at the Rugby World Cup, almost as popular as the players on the pitch.
He was the famous man.
That's former Australia international Matt Giteau asking for a selfie. If you hadn't already noticed, Hiroshi Moriyama, known as Bak-sun, is not wearing a shirt. The jersey is painted onto his body. Bak-sun started doing it to liven up the crowds at Japanese rugby matches. He said they were too quiet, and he's amazed by his newfound stardom.
I am surprised because I started this 5 years ago, as I said, but no reaction at the beginning and a small reaction gradually. But when this World Cup starts, you know, everything changed.
The unsung hero is Bak-sun's wife, Rika. She spends up to an hour and a half painting the rugby kits onto her husband. How difficult is it?
This is not difficult for me, but difficult for Rika, my wife, to do it.
Do you feel sorry for Rika sometimes?
Really.
She's a good wife.
Very much so.
Does the body paint stay on, whether it's hot sun or rain?
This is actually 100% waterproof, so rain doesn't matter. But the hot weather is a kind of problem.
Baksan has saved up his holiday to take time off work and has tickets to 27 games. He's trying to wear the colours of all 20 competing nations at least once. How important is this Rugby World Cup to Japan?
I think this has to be a momentum for Japanese rugby to become major sport in Japan. So I think this is super important.
Today, it's the green and gold of Australia, with a tribute to winger Adam Ashley Cooper on the back. Coopy went on to score a try, although the Wallabies lost to Wales. More often than not, though, when Baksan wears a country's colours, they win. Alex Thomas, CNN, Japan.